Good afternoon and good morning, everybody. Welcome to this fourth edition of the CEPR Graduate Institute webinar, drawing on the research on the COVID epidemics and economic issues. Today, we are very happy to welcome Anton Korinek and Zachary Bethune from the University of Virginia, who will present their papers on the policy externalities. The format is the usual one. Both speakers will present for 40 minutes. Then we will have 20 minutes of question and answers. I propose that we leave the questions to the end to ensure that we have a more interactive discussion. You can ask your questions in two ways. You can use a Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen, or you can raise your hand and Magdalena will give you the mic. If during the presentation there are burning comprehension questions that you'd like to ask, we'll let you use a Q&A option, and one of the two authors will then be able to reply through the chat option to you. So with this, thanks Anton and Zach for joining us. And without further waiting, I'll give you the floor for the presentation.
Thank you, Cedric. And thanks to CEPR for hosting us and Cedric for moderating us. And thank you to you all for joining us today. We are presenting our paper on infection externalities, pursuing herd immunity or containment. And let me get my slides up here. Okay, great. So to give just a brief motivation, policymakers are facing a really crucial choice these days on how to deal with the COVID-19 epidemic. And to kind of paint the two starkest options, one choice would be to just let the disease spread and let populations acquire herd immunity. The other stark choice would be to try whatever it takes to contain the disease with an eye towards trying to eradicate it. And if we look at countries around the world, we can see that different places seem to be really following different public policy strategies in this respect. So in China, South Korea, but also a number of European countries. I've put up a slide for Germany here. We can see that the active case numbers, they're here normalized as a fraction of the population, have really been declining quite a lot from their peak. So these three countries in the top of the figure, they really seem to be following a containment strategy. If we look at the three countries at the bottom, United States, Sweden, Russia, they seem to be following more of a strategy of letting the disease spread. And active cases are still increasing. And yeah, we don't know, of course, what the future will bring. But for now, they are following really a very different public health strategy. So a lot of people have suggested that this may actually reflect that different countries follow a different trade-off between lives versus livelihoods. So what do we do in our paper? Well, we employ two benchmark epidemiological models, an SIS model and an SIR model. So we use both of these models because at this point, it is not 100% clear yet whether people who recover from COVID will actually gain permanent immunity. So what's the SIS model? A lot of you have heard a lot about the different kinds of epidemiological models, but let me quickly review it. In the SIS model, you start out as a susceptible individual. You can become infected at a certain rate, and if you are infected, you're sick for a certain number of periods, but there is a rate at which individuals recover. And in the SIS model, if you recover, you go back into the susceptible pool. On the other hand, in the SIR model, if you recover from an infection, you go back into a pool of recovered or resistant agents who can no longer be infected. So that's an absorbing state. And as
Anton,
we will see,
yeah. Sorry to interrupt, but you come with some static on your microphone. So maybe if we can put like a minute if you want to change to a headset mic or something like that.
I will let Zach continue for a moment, and I will switch.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
Okay, so I'll take over for Anton while he's changing his mic. So we're going to look at two models, the SIS and the SIR model. They're very similar. They're epidemiological compartmental models, and they group agents into one of three states or two states, depending on which model you're in, either susceptible, infected in the SIS model, or susceptible, infected, and recovered in the SIR model. Now, what's a little different from what we're going to introduce than what the standard epidemiological models will be introducing is that in the standard epidemiological models, they model the transition rates of agents between these states as exogenous. They could be time varying, and so changing across time, but they're exogenous. So what we're going to do is integrate economic activity into the model. We're going to allow agents to choose an extent of activity, and that's going to impact their individual transition rates between these states, importantly between the susceptible and the infected state. Our goal in this paper is to then quantify and characterize the extent of the externalities, and then describe how those externalities are disciplining the outcomes of the disease. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, Anton, are you back with us?
Yeah.
Okay, so feel free to take over and then I can switch back again. Thanks.
Pardon me?
I said I'll switch to Anton now and then I'll take back over in a minute.
Okay. So to summarize our findings, we find that infection externalities are indeed very large. To give just one example, at the state where the US is right now, individuals perceive the private cost of an infection to be around $18,000, whereas the social cost of an infection is more like $55,000. What we also find is that without intervention, a society will implicitly arrive at a herd immunity strategy. So it means the disease will spread, and in our simulations, it will actually spread for a number of years. And as long as the disease is active, there will be a persistent economic cost because agents are precautionary and choose to reduce their activity to avoid becoming infected. On the other hand, the optimal public health strategy that internalizes these externalities is one that we call a smart containment strategy. And it focuses on containing the infected via testing, tracing, quarantining. In that scenario, the disease is quickly contained, kind of like what we showed on the graph on the first slide. And the economic costs are also much more short-lived. So we arrive at a much faster recovery, saving a country like the US something like the equivalent of $10 trillion. So to summarize this, there is no trade-off between lives and livelihoods. What is best from an epidemiological perspective is in fact also best for the economy, because individuals won't go out and really spend until the disease is over. So I will just flash this literature slide briefly. Our work relates to epidemiology and to economics, and there has been a lot of activity in the sphere of economics in the past few months. Now, our contribution is to focus on what are the public health strategies and the role of externalities in these public health strategies, and present what we find as the optimal policy in that kind of framework. So let me jump to our model. As I mentioned, we start by introducing an SIS model where individuals who recover go back into the pool of susceptible, so you can get reinfected with COVID. In that model, we assume that there's a unit measure of agents who can be split into two compartments, into a susceptible compartment or an infected compartment. And we keep track of these by using the letters S and I, which are, of course, time varying, I should say. The laws of motion from epidemiology which I'm sure a lot of you have already seen a bunch of times in recent weeks, are as follows. So the susceptible pool shrinks because there are people who become infected and who fall out of that pool and into the infected pool. That's why we have the minus beta times I times S, where beta is the meeting rate at which susceptible individuals bump into others. That's what we will raise to economic activity on the next slide. I is both the fraction of infected individuals in the population, but since it is the fraction, it's also the probability of the susceptible agent meeting an infected agent. And this term here on the slide is multiplied by S because that's the number of susceptible individuals that are out there. What's the second term? So the second term captures that infected individuals recover at rate gamma. And if you recover, then you're subtracted from the infected pool, but you go back into the susceptible pool. So let me now hand over to Zach.
Okay, so here's the optimization problem of an individual agent in the model. We're going to allow them to choose an extent of what we'll call activity A. That's going to be a function of their individual state, whether they're susceptible or infected. We're going to normalize it to be between 0 and 1. So 1 represents full activity, sort of the first best from the individual agent's perspective. 0 represents no activity. Next slide, please. Anton, next slide, please. Okay, so the utility of the infected individual is going to be the same as the utility of the susceptible individual minus a cost of being infected CI. So we're going to assume that it's costly for an individual agent when they transition from the susceptible to the infected status. They bear this flow cost C. Now we're going to allow the cost to be a function of the aggregate measure of infected agents in the economy to capture things like healthcare capacity of the system. So if there's more infected agents in the economy, you might imagine that healthcare capacity is stressed and your individual cost of infection is going to be high. You'll see in a little bit when we get to the calibration, we're going to imagine that the cost of infection not only includes the idea that you may be sick for 3 weeks in bed, that might be lost output, but on an order of magnitude larger, much more importantly, that you bear the risk of losing your life, of death. And so it's the fatality risk that's going to be the largest quantitatively, and that's how we're going to eventually discipline this cost of infection. We don't explicitly model death in the model. It's all coming in through this cost of being infected state. Okay, so when individual agents are choosing their actions, they're going to take as given the actions of all the other agents in the economy, and importantly, the aggregate infection rate, which means that they're going to take as given, they're only going to choose their actions, keeping in mind that they have a limited effect on their own risk of becoming infected. Okay. At the bottom here is how we're going to model an individual agent's risk of becoming infected. So the meeting rate will allow to depend on both the activity level of susceptible and infected agents. There's also a level parameter, beta naught, that represents sort of the maximal amount of disease transmission given a measure of infected and susceptible agents, if all the agents in the economy are engaging in full activity. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, here's how we're going to determine an individual agent's problem. So there's a few different ways that you could set up these problems. Here's one way that we think is nice. We're going to write down an individual agent's Hamiltonian problem. Capital I bar is going to represent the aggregate measure of infected agents in the economy. A capital I without a bar is going to represent an individual agent's state variable. So you can allow that to be, for instance, like the probability that an individual agent is currently infected. So you'll see they weigh when they're choosing their actions, dependent on their health status. They're going to weigh whether they're infected or they're susceptible. And then the last term in the Hamiltonian is going to represent their individual transition probability from the susceptible state into the infected state. They have a cost So the co-state variable VI is going to represent the private cost that an individual agent perceives from transitioning from susceptible to infected. So notice in the individual transition equation, again, they're taking the actions of, when they're susceptible, choosing their activity level, they're taken as given the actions of infected agents, and they're taken as given the aggregate measure of the infected in the population. Okay, the second bullet point is going to represent the first order conditions of the household with respect to their activity level. The intuition is kind of the standard marginal cost, marginal benefit calculation that these agents do. When an agent is susceptible, they're going to weigh the benefit of increasing their activity level with the marginal cost of potentially increasing their infection rate. So the first three terms on the right-hand side of the first order condition represent the marginal increase in the infection rate, beta naught AI times I, valued at their private cost of becoming infected, VI. So you can see that as there's more infections in the population, or if infected individuals are increasing their activity level, private agents will by themselves reduce their economic activity to slow their own disease transmission. Now for infected agents, in this model, once you're infected, there's sort of nothing else you can do that's going to impact your transition rates. There's an exogenous transition rate from your infection, from being infected, in this case, back to susceptible. So we see that for infected agents, they're engaging in full activity. There's no cost of reducing activity at all. Now, how do private agents weigh the marginal cost, VI, of becoming infected? And that's represented by the last equation on the slide. The flow cost, or sort of like the asset pricing equation, the cost of becoming infected is a function of the utility loss of switching from susceptible to infected. Notice that if AI is higher than AS, part of it is a gain that you can go from curbing your activity to reduce your infection rate to increasing your activity. But you have this last term, that's the cost of infection, that could potentially be quite large with a disease like COVID. The last three terms represent that when an agent becomes infected, when an agent becomes infected, they're no longer susceptible, and then they have this exogenous transition rate out of the infection status. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so when we go from the individual's problem to the planner's problem, the benefit of setting up in the Hamiltonian is that it's going to be the exact same Hamiltonian in the planner's problem. The key differences now, which I've highlighted, are that one, the planner, unlike individual agents, will take understands that they can control the law of motion of the aggregate infection rate. So you don't see any bars over the eyes. The planner understands that they can impact that with their choice variables. The second thing, which I've highlighted in blue, is that the planner has a different cost of switching an agent from susceptible to infected status. So the optimality conditions for the planner, the first one looks quite similar as that of the private agent. The planner still weighs the benefit of increasing activity for susceptible with the cost of increasing their infection rate. The difference there is that the planner then prices the cost of an additional infection differently than private agents do. Now, the second first order condition is going to differ from the private economy. The planner understands that when they increase the infection, the activity level of the infected, that they're also increasing the infection risk on all the susceptible population. The increase in the infection risk of the susceptible population, the first three terms on the right-hand side of that first order condition in blue represent the gain in the marginal gain in the infection rate of the susceptible, right? The marginal gain of the increase in the susceptible times the cost of the planner perceives the additional infections, WI. In terms of the log motion of the cost, again, the planner weighs the utility loss of putting an agent from susceptible to infected. The differences are the two terms in blue. So the planner also internalizes the externalities inherent in increasing infections with the cost. And the planner also understands the last term in blue, that when they increase when an agent transitions from susceptible to infected, there's also an increase in the cost for all the susceptible agents in the economy because you have an additional infected agent. Okay, next slide, please. Okay.
So,
yeah, go ahead.
Our first proposition is that we can show analytically that the planner who internalizes these infection externalities would choose a lower level of activity for the infected. So they would basically quarantine the infected. And furthermore, for given actions, the planner also perceives a higher social cost of a marginal infection, which implies that the planner's action will lead to more precautionary behavior, ceteris paribus. So we have displayed a simple graph here for the SIS model that traces out what would happen in an economy where we have parameterized all the parameters to correspond to COVID-19 in the US. And the starting point is that there is an infection rate of about 0.3%, which reflects where the US was basically 2 weeks ago. What you can see, and I will go over the calibration parameters in more detail later, but what you can see here just from a very high level perspective is that in the decentralized equilibrium, the disease will increase and will converge to some kind of steady state equilibrium. In the planner's allocation, on the other hand, the planner contains the infected, the infection rate goes down and converges to 0. So you can really see that the planner pursues a containment policy, whereas the decentralized equilibrium leads to a policy, to an allocation where the disease simply spreads and it becomes endemic. And I should emphasize that this result holds for a really wide range of parameters. So we varied the cost of an infection to correspond to anything from COVID to something much lighter. And the planner in our environment always tries to contain the disease, whereas the decentralized equilibrium always makes it endemic. So how can we implement the planner's allocation? How can we decentralize it in a system? And we're suggesting 4 different avenues here. And I should mention, these 4 avenues are not meant to all reflect realism, but some of them are put up on this slide only because they give us extra intuition for how to think about the externalities of infectious diseases. So the first and kind of most obvious implementation is that the planner imposes quantity limits on the activities of the susceptible and of the infected. And what we typically find much tighter limits on the infected than on the susceptible. And that corresponds to a policy of like quarantining or lockdown. The second way of thinking about it, and this is less for realism and more to kind of capture the inefficient wedges that arise in an epidemiological model. The second way is to something that we can think of as taxing the activities of infected and susceptible agents. And you can see the tax formulas that would be required to do this. So the first formula captures the tax that we would need to impose on the activity of infected agents. And that tax would simply reflect the marginal cost of infection risk that an infected agent would impose on other agents. So that's the difference between the optimality condition of the planner and of the private agent. The second tax formula reflects that the only reason why the planner would intervene in the actions of the susceptible is because the planner perceives a different shadow price of an extra infection. So that's the difference between WI, the planner's shadow price of an infection, and VI, the individually perceived shadow price of an infection. Since the planner recognizes it's more socially costly to have another infected person, the planner would also make the susceptible agent to engage in more precautionary behavior than what is individually rational. Now, a third way of thinking about how we can implement the planner's optimal allocation is to impose the tax on the infected that we have seen up there and a utility penalty on becoming infected. Again, this is not meant to be public policy advice, but it kind of reflects that the big problem is that individual agents don't realize how costly it is for them to become infected, because once you're infected, it's not only that you suffer from it, but you can also spread it to others. And finally, the fourth way of decentralizing the planner's allocation is, again, to impose a tax on the infected to make them engage in less activity. And furthermore, to impose a flow utility penalty on the infected, which reflects the uninternalized adverse effects that they have on others. So what are the external effects that an infected agent has? Well, first of all, there is this problem that additional infections may overwhelm the healthcare capacity, and that's captured by this term C prime of I. So the cost of an infection may go up if the number of infections go up. And the second term captures directly the infection externalities. So if you're infected, you can pass it on to other susceptible agents, and that's what's reflected by that. And again, this is what infected agents don't internalize, and what public policy measures, public health measures are supposed to capture. So these were the results for the SIS model. Now let me briefly turn to the SIR model. And the beautiful thing is that in some ways only very little changes conceptually. So conceptually, we now add a third compartment, third epidemiological compartment to the system. Agents can also be recovered, which means they will no longer capture the disease. The laws of motion are a little bit modified. If you're susceptible, you can become infected. If you're infected, there's this inflow beta SI and an outflow by individuals who recover. And if you recover, then you enter this absorbing state, and that's why the compartment R only has an inflow, so R dot can only be positive and never negative. What does the optimality, what do the optimality conditions of agents look like? Well, we set up a Hamiltonian again, and what you can see is the Hamiltonian here in the SIR model is really very similar to the one in the SIS model. What is also kind of quite intuitive is that the activity level of the resistant agents is always at 1. They have no reason to reduce their activity because they're immune and they cannot capture the disease anymore. So they will always engage in what is optimal from an economic perspective. The other thing I would like to draw your attention to is, so this Hamiltonian has to keep track not only of the number of infected individuals now, but also the number of recovered. And that's why we have an additional shadow price here at the end of the second line, VR, which captures essentially the marginal benefit of becoming recovered. Now, the optimality conditions for both susceptible and infected individuals are actually identical to the SIS model. So that means we don't need to put that up again. Let me turn now to the calibration of our SIR model, where you can become resistant if you recover. The way we calibrate everything is we assume that the model takes place in weekly episodes. We use an annualized discount rate of 4%, and we choose epidemiological parameters kind of in line with what the epidemiology literature suggests. So the recovery rate gamma is 1/3 because the average length of the disease is about 3 weeks. The beta 0, the baseline rate of transmission, if nobody engages in reduced activity, is calibrated such that the disease reproduction factor R is about 2.5, which is what epidemiologists kind of use as a median estimate. Now, to map the activity levels into our macroeconomic model, we assume that this economy features a unit mass of goods, age from 0 to 1, and a fraction phi of those goods require physical contact. we assume that phi is equal to 25%, so 1/4 of the economic activity requires physical interaction. And then we assume that there is a flow utility that's kind of an integral over all the goods. You have log utility in consuming a given good and linear disutility in producing the good. So for all the goods that don't require physical contact, the optimal level of production and consumption is C star equals 1. And then we assume that if people reduce their economic activity, they reduce the production and consumption of the goods that do require physical contact in proportion to A. So they scale down the C star by the factor A. And as a result of that, the flow utility of individuals is phi times log A minus A plus, and the remaining term is a constant because it does not depend on economic activity. How do we capture the cost of disease? Well, we assume that if you become infected, there is a baseline cost C0, and then there is a factor 1 plus kappa I, which reflects that the cost of disease may go up if the number of infected go up and healthcare systems become overburdened. So to determine the baseline C0, I will show you on the next slide how we get at that. But let me just mention the parameter kappa is calibrated such that it reflects the ventilator capacity in the US and assumes that basically if we run out of ventilators, the mortality rate increases by 20% for those who do require ventilators. So how do we get at the baseline cost of disease? Well, we observe in the paper that the vast majority of the costs that arise is really costs due to excess mortality, and the purely economic costs from being infected actually pale in comparison. So what we do is we do a statistical value of life calculation that takes into account that individuals in different age cohorts face vastly different mortality rates, and furthermore, different life expectancies, different values of statistical life. We arrive ultimately at an expected cost corresponding to $50,000 for an individual infection. And that cost of $50,000 in our framework translates into this parameter C0 that I showed in the previous slide. So let me now hand back to Zach.
Great, thanks, Anton. Next slide. So it's intuitive to first think about what the planner versus the private agents are doing at the onset of the epidemic. So what we're doing in these figures are, imagine you start with some initial infection rate, that's on the x-axis, where you have no immunity at all built up in the society. So we're setting R equal to 0. On the left-hand side is showing you how private agents perceive the cost of an additional infection, how it's going to discipline their behavior versus what the planner does in green. You can see that the planner weighs the cost of an infection around 3 times as much as private agents do. If you imagine starting the economy at 0.3% infection rate, we can convert, or we can see that these are in dollars. Private agents perceive the cost of additional infection of $18,000. That's the risk that they're thinking about, versus the planner is around on the order of $55,000. And that's, again, taken as a marginal cost per individual, per infection. Now, on the right-hand side, you can see that the policy functions of either the planner or the private agents, again, starting from some initial infection rate. And what's the key difference in this figure? In blue are the private agents' actions. The solid blue line represents how susceptible agents are curbing their economic activity as they face a higher infection rate, initial infection rate in the economy. If the infection rate is 0, there's no need to curb your activity at all. Your risk of infection is really small. But as that infection grows, even up to 1%, we see that private agents by themselves, susceptible agents, are pulling back economic activity quite substantially. Now, as we mentioned before, infected agents don't curb their activity at all. They always set their activity level at full capacity equal to 1. Now, what is the planner doing? Well, the planner perceives a really high cost of infection. Which means what? Which means on one hand, they want to reduce infections in the economy, or there's a force that wants them to reduce the infection rate in the economy. How the plan is going to achieve that with an initial infection rate that's this small, between 0 and 5%, they essentially reduce the economic activity of all the infected agents in the economy, of which it's not very costly for social welfare because there's not too many infected agents initially. Now, because they're reducing the activity level of infectious agents, they're quarantining the infected, it means that they don't have to reduce the activity too much of the susceptible, right? So even though they weigh a very high cost of the susceptible pool becoming infected, because the infected agents are being reduced to quarantine so much, they don't have to really change the activity level of the susceptible very much. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is then asking, what are the different paths of the infection? Again, starting from a 0.3% infection rate. The left-hand figure is going to show you the path of the infected population. The middle panel is going to show you the path of the susceptible and resistant pool. And then the right panel is going to show you the path of economic activity, social and economic activity. What we can see is that between the decentralized and the planner's allocation, the path of the infections look really different. In the decentralized equilibrium, even though private agents are reducing their economic activity around, about 15% initially, you can see on the very right-hand figure, and then as infections increase, they have to reduce economic activity by even more, over half, across the first 20 weeks or so. Infections spread in the decentralized economy and then come slowly down. Even after, so these are in time periods of weeks, you see even after around 2 years, there's still infections in the economy and under private agents, about 0.5%. That's higher than the initial starting point. Now the planner is going to look very different. We see that because they quarantine the infected, they reduce infections almost immediately to 0 over the first about 5 or 8 weeks or so. And so the middle panel is going to really highlight the key differences between these two economies. So one is that in the decentralized economy, because there's a big spike in infections, we see that we're building towards herd immunity relatively quickly. The recovered population, the decentralized economy, that's in the dotted blue line, builds up very quickly. And after the first 2 years or so, you see about 40% of the population has already been infected, and in this model receives immunity forever, right? Now, of course, what that implies is that 40% of the population had to transition through the infection state, which is very, very costly. On the other hand, in this containment strategy that the planner's doing, the state variables don't change essentially at all. The recovered, the susceptible population stays close to 100%. The recovered population stays close to 0, which means that if there's any point in the future where you decide to transition back to this take away the containment of the infected, you're kind of back in the initial starting point, initial state of the economy. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. Now, in our baseline case, we made the assumption that both private agents and the planner can observe the epidemiological status of individuals. Let me switch to, so what we're going to do here is imagine that both private individuals and the planner cannot observe their epidemiological status of either infected or susceptible. Once they're recovered, they can engage in full activity. Let me switch over from the, given we're slowly running out of time, next slide please, to the figures of what this implies. So in red, what we've done is taken the previous figure and then illustrated the case of the planner's problem when they cannot observe the status of individuals. What you can see is now the planner still decides to decrease, starting from an initial infection rate of 0.3%, still decides to decrease the infection rate in the population towards 0. It's slower than in the case where they can observe, simply quarantine the infected. The means at which they do that so is very different. Now they're forced to reduce the activity level of everyone. You can see in the middle panel, close to 50% initially, and you can see that even after the infection rate gets close to 0, at least over the first 2 years, the planner cannot relent on keeping the level of economic activity quite low. Now, in the very, very long run in this model, what it does look like, because infections never quite reach 0, you do eventually build up herd immunity, but it takes on the order of thousands of years to do that. So at least for the first 2 years, the first 5 years or so, the planner is still forced to reduce their economic activity. quite drastically. Let me end with one slide. Next slide, please. What our model can do, actually, sorry, can you go forward one more slide? Okay. What our model can also try to quantify, we don't have anything that looks like a vaccine. So obviously, the big story that's coming out of these two, the optimal policy versus the decentralized, is optimal policy really tries to contain the disease quickly, which means that you still have a big pool of susceptible agents, which means there's also a big gain to developing a vaccine. And we can model a vaccine, or at least think about pricing the benefit of vaccine from transitioning agents from susceptible to recovered, right, giving them immunity. Next slide, please. What this figure shows is how either the social value of an additional vaccination, again, it's a marginal concept, given where you are in this resistant, the measure of the current resistant population, we're fixing the infection rate at 0.3%. So in those previous transition figures, the infection rate is moving through time. This is not perfectly capturing what's happening there. But you can imagine if there's 0.3% infections in the population, for any given resistant population, what's the additional gain of a vaccine? The left-hand figure shows what that looks like in the laissez-faire, the decentralized economy. In blue is how private agents are valuing the gain of becoming vaccinated. And they do so about $9,000 when there's no resistant agents in the economy. Now, the social gain in that state of moving under the laissez-faire equilibrium of moving an agent from from susceptible to resistant is much, much higher, around $70,000. You can see the gain in the vaccine is then falling. Around herd immunity, around 60%, you get a big decrease in the gain from a vaccine. It doesn't quite go to zero, because you still, even if you have 60% resistant population, which in this figure means that you have about 40% susceptible population, these agents can still, even though infections must be decreasing at that point, they can still get the disease, which is costly. Now, the last thing I'll say is on the right-hand side, we can see that I've reproduced the private gain in blue, and the difference between the green and the red line there is what the planner values the gain of a vaccine in these two different allocations, either when they can observe the status of the health status of the individual, or when they cannot. And you can see that when they can observe the health status, if you have sufficient testing of the population, tracing, and that you can effectively quarantine the infected individuals, the planner has very little value for a vaccine. This, if you can do the smart containment well, then the vaccine is not really worth it to you, because again, you just simply isolate the infected individuals. If you can't, the planner would be willing to pay much more for the vaccine. And you can see there in red, initially at zero recovered agents, it's on the order of around $50,000 per individual. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so to quickly conclude, what we hope to illustrate in this paper is that, one, the externalities with infectious diseases, particularly what we've calibrated to COVID, are quite high. In the decentralized economy, you go to herd immunity relatively quickly, even though private agents are curbing their activity, susceptible agents are curbing their activity. However, under the planner's case, you quickly contain the disease to limit its fallout. Great, thank you for your time.
Well, thank you very much, Tack and Anton. That was very interesting, very clear. See, we have a first question from Americ Connery, who asks, does your model mean that the quarantine is efficient but we have to keep it for 1 or 2 years instead of the weeks or months that we usually talk about?
So if I may jump in here. So that's a good question. There is kind of two different time horizons that we worry about. The first one is, for how long does this containment strategy have to be implemented until we basically don't have to worry about the disease anymore, and we can go back to our, let's call it, normal life that we used to live 3 months ago. And the second question is, if a given individual is infected, how long do they have to be quarantined? So for the second question, we defer to the epidemiologists. And they say, I think my understanding is, if you don't have symptoms quarantine should last for 2 weeks. If you do have symptoms, there's a certain number of days until you're symptomless that you should also remain quarantined. But that's not our realm in economics. Now, the question is, for how long do we have to implement these containment strategies if we want them to be implemented? And there, the answer from our model is, well, you really have to do this until the population has herd immunity, which can be achieved in 2 ways. One way is you let the disease spread, and the other way is you vaccinate a sufficient fraction of the population. The second way of vaccinating is probably the one that is much more desirable from a welfare perspective. But yeah, it does seem that in some countries, we are right now on a path to herd immunity by just letting the disease spread. That's not optimal from our perspective. Zach, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I'll only add a little bit the intuition. You know, one reason why we do these 2 models, the SIS and SIR, is because the evidence is not clear yet on if individuals after getting the disease actually build up immunity, and then also for how long. So these are 2 extreme cases. One, you get immunity forever, and the other one, you never get immunity. You transition from being infected back to susceptible. So in that SIS model, what we find is that for the planner, right, in this case where you can observe the status, for the planner to shoot towards this zero infection steady state in the model, they have to continue to do this quarantine policy forever, which means, right, you'd have to implement, again, testing and tracing and quarantining for the infected forever. Now, again, you might imagine that an effective vaccine comes along before that, where you transition from this SIS world back to something else. But that intuition still stays true in the SIS, where there can be no immunity. Right?
Yeah. So let me draw on some of the questions we're getting here, and I'm going to try to compile some of them together. So the question of, in practicality, how would you implement the trade-off? And let me tag on this a question that I had penciled on my end. So you have a homogeneous population, but in reality, older people are way more susceptible. So even if you don't know who's infected, who's not, can you do a targeted confinement by age group? And to add to that, another question that was raised, going to the gain on vaccination. So you find it's slow, but the person, Svet Vijay, is asking, well, but the cost of other policies such as continuing testing and tracing is quite expensive. So if we think in terms of relative benefits of various policy options, what would you say?
Yeah, so on the first question, on the age-specific nature of the disease, it is absolutely true that the externalities imposed on different people depend on their age. And what our model captures or reflects is kind of an average externality. So in practice, it does make a lot of sense for more susceptible individuals to distance a little bit more. Probably also for less susceptible individuals to distance a little bit less than what the representative age review would predict. But I think the kind of crucial message that our paper wants to get across is that from a big picture perspective, what we really want to do is we want to contain this disease. We don't want to let it spread. And in order to contain it, we need to isolate all the infected, no matter what their age, no matter what their risk factors are. And this is a result that's so robust that I'm quite confident, even if we account for all the heterogeneity, it will still hold, and it will hold very strongly. Now, on the second question, on the gains from a vaccine. So what we highlighted in our results is that in principle, there is a substitutability between eradicating the disease and having a vaccine. And we can see that for diseases that we have successfully eradicated globally, for which we don't vaccinate people anymore in most countries. Having said that, COVID is currently so widespread around the world that practically speaking, there will probably always be a certain risk of reinfection, even if you are a country that has successfully contained it. There may be travelers coming in from another country that will bring it back. And for that reason, which, you know, in our specific framework, we haven't captured that kind of multi-country world. But for that reason, I personally would say that the values to developing a vaccine are still really high because it's the only thing that will prevent societies from becoming reinfected when there is like one traveler that brings the germ back.
Yeah, let me quickly add if I can. So it's true that our model doesn't have much to say about the costs of implementing or developing sufficient testing and tracing systems, but we can value the price to gain. And what we hope to show you today is that the gain is so quite large that we think it's on the order of a magnitude larger than it would take to implement a testing and tracing system. To give you some perspective, at least in the US, we came up with the figures that the gain of implementing, of moving from this herd immunity strategy where there's no intervention to the smart containment strategy is on the order of $10 trillion. That's trillion dollars in the US. So the gains are really massive to do that. Now, you may be concerned there's some other kind of feasibility issues with testing, right? Because in the model, you have to test and trace and quarantine everyone. But at least the model has something to say about the gains.
Okay. A question that we're getting from Vincenzo Galasso. So whether the model can help us with inferences about differentiated returns to labor markets to have kind of phased in deconfinement. Can you have something like this, or is this to aggregate a model to speak about this fine tuning?
Yeah, so to be honest, on this particular question, our model does not have a lot to say, except that we should always prioritize containing and eradicating the disease from the population as a whole. I don't know, Zach, do you have any thoughts on differential entry?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, to really answer that well, I think you would need a more serious model of these interactions in a labor market. And so we're, our model is more reduced form than that. There are some very good papers being written that integrate some of these disease dynamics into labor markets. And if you go to our paper, we have some references on that.
Okay, let me put to you two quick questions that I had. The first one is more like a modeling question. In your probability of infection, it's a product of the AS and AI. And that basically looks like an increasing returns to scale specification to me. Have you tried to see what if you have on each of the A's some exponential that would make it more like a Cobb-Douglas? So you would get some decreasing returns to scale in your infection technology, if I can call it that way. And my second question would be, so you developed the optimal policy and contract. Now, if in your model you get it wrong at first, so some government takes time to realize that the epidemic is here and it's behind the curve, and yet decide to implement. Does this alter the terms of the trade of the gains of moving to the decentralized due to the planner solution? In other words, is there a point where if you pass this point and it's just too late to do things right?
So for our, let me speak to the second question. I will let Zach speak to the first question because he is the expert in matching. On the second question, in principle, analytically, there are these threshold effects in the SIS model that at some point the cost of eradicating it may become too high. But what we find for our calibration of COVID is no matter if we use the statistical value of life or if we use the economic value of life only, which is significantly lower. And in particular, I think Charles has pointed out in the Q&A that the economic cost of a retiree no longer working is really zero. So even if we use that low cost parameter, it is still desirable to contain COVID, because COVID is such a devastating disease, if I may say. So we found that it would have to be a disease that's less costly than the common cold for the planner to let it spread throughout the population.
Okay.
Yeah, also, so on the first question, I think it's really interesting. So what we have here, you may have heard of it as a quadratic matching function, which has been studied in the matching literature quite a bit. Diamond has some old papers thinking about dynamics with these quadratic matching functions. I think what's interesting, I think you sort of, the quadratic matching function is a bit agnostic about, right, the increase in activity by the infected has kind of the same effect on the meeting rate as increased activity of the susceptible. And I think what you're imagining is that you could put some elasticities there and assume that for instance, the increased activity of the infected is going to have a higher impact on these meeting rates or something like that. So what we're doing is kind of treating those as equal. I think it'd be interesting if you had good data on something about context and disease transmission to try to discipline those elasticities. The second aspect of the dynamics might change. You might get some strategic substitutability in the activity level of the two agents when you change from the quadratic matching function to something like Cobb-Douglas. But we haven't explored it yet. It's a good question.
Okay. Let me take the chance.
And maybe I should also,
please go ahead.
Apologies. Maybe I should also add, it's really kind of the epidemiologists who have introduced that type of quadratic matching setup. Okay. And we have kind of taken that from the epidemiology literature.
I had one last question about the variant of the model where there is limited information, so the planner doesn't know who is who. But if I understand right, in that variant, you still assume that the individual know whether they're I or S, right? And what happens in your model is if I don't know whether I'm actually infected or not, because then I cannot decide to change my activity.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So in general equilibrium, sort of this is the way it works. If you don't know if you're susceptible or infected, when you're susceptible, you have you place some probability on currently being infected, and that's going to be a force that actually increases the activity level of the susceptible, because they understand that if they're infected, there's no reason why they should be curbing their activity. Yeah. Now, the other case is going to be a mitigating case, right? That when you're infected, you still think that you potentially could be susceptible, and you decrease your activity. The infected would decrease their activity level from that. So in general equilibrium, the question is kind of which one of these forces worked out. So what we showed today is, we were just showing the decentralized case with visible status. But it seems like we're working on this case now, and it seems like the second case sort of works out, that activity level is sort of decreased in a mitigating way.
Okay. Good. Very good. So I see we have no further questions. Well, I would like to thank both of you and all the participants in the audience. Next week, we will continue our series of these seminars. So thanks a lot, Anton and Zach, and also Mariolina for the technical support. And we'll see you next week.